Our next panel is now going to be talking about fostering inclusivity and multi-stakeholder participation in privacy tech development. Our panelists include Sam Stockwell, CETaS Research Associate, Dan Sexton, CTO of Internet Watch Foundation, and they'll be moderated by Florian Ostmann, who is the head of AI governance and regulatory innovation at the Alan Turing Institute.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next session. As Anna mentioned, we'll be talking for the next half an hour or so about privacy tech, and especially the importance of multi-stakeholder involvement in the development of privacy technology. Now, I'm assuming for this audience today, in particular, the topic of privacy tech doesn't need much of an introduction. Most of you will be very, very well familiar both with the lively debates that we've seen in recent years about the technological choices at hand when it comes to designing privacy-protecting features, but also the often quite heated political debates that we've seen around perceived tensions between the protection of privacy of technology users on the one hand and other objectives or policy considerations such as law enforcement, national security, issues around harmful content on online platforms, and so on. A lot of those controversies, of course, have played out in the context of the Online Safety Bill and the Online Safety Act in the UK, and that forms part of the backdrop of what we will be discussing. Now, I think just to frame the session, with a few more words, what the debates over recent years, I think, show are two things. On the one hand, given sort of the value-laden nature of the debate, the importance of adopting a broad approach and an inclusive approach in terms of making sure that all relevant stakeholder voices get the consideration in making decisions about how technology is designed, the consideration that they deserve. So that's the inclusiveness point. The second point, I think, is one of sort of urgency in actually making progress and finding common ground. Sort of we know that privacy is a high-stakes matter, for the public, for policymakers, for technologists, and we can't afford to sort of lean back and just be caught in a stalemate where opposing views are remain unresolved and there's a lack of clarity on how technology should be designed going forward. And so in addition to this inclusiveness point, there is a need to really think about how we can reach agreement across stakeholder groups, across different positions. And there's, of course, somewhat of a tension there, at least theoretically, in terms of broadening inclusion and reaching agreement. And so I think that those will be, that kind of tension is part of what we'll be thinking about and get to over the course of the session. As with the other sessions today, this is a topic that the CETaS team has done in-depth work on. And so I'm delighted that Sam will kick us off with a short presentation of a report that the CETaS team published on the future of privacy by design. And we'll then have a discussion. Delighted that Dan is joining us from the Internet Watch Foundation with deep experience in civil society participation in privacy tech contexts. So we'll have that discussion. Please feel free to go ahead while Sam is presenting and share any questions you may have via Slido. I'll be keeping an eye on Slido, and we'll try to cover as many questions as possible later on. But for now, over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Florian. So yeah, I wanted to just first pick up on a point that Florian raised, which I think is really important in recognizing that this technology area is still really critical today, even though there's a lot of focus on AI and LLMs, for instance, which we've seen earlier in the various kind of presentations. And that's because of the Online Safety Act. And what was really interesting last year when that bill was going through various stages of Parliament before it came into law in October was that there was a huge amount of media coverage, controversy, and public debate over a very specific set of provisions within that act. And that was to do with legally obliging encrypted communications platforms like WhatsApp to scan for illegal and harmful content and then to remove that content. And the reason why there was so much controversy over it is because some academics and the platforms themselves, like WhatsApp, feared that in order to do that, they would have to break end-to-end encryption mechanisms, or the ability to, say, send a message to someone without anyone else viewing that message. But equally, what we've seen over the last, say, 5 years, and I'm sure Dan can speak to this in more detail, is data showing a growing link between a number of specific online harms, whether that be the circulation of, say, child sexual abuse material, but also online grooming and encrypted platforms. And that's because although encryption offers a huge amount of benefits to ordinary users in protecting their data, securing bank transactions, and so on, it can also be exploited by criminals and others conducting illegal activities to add an extra layer of anonymity to their actions. But the problem is, obviously, as I said, we've got these risks that are materializing and potentially causing harm to users. And what the debates over the Online Safety Act showed is that there's really so much disagreement and division over the solutions that it just seems really difficult to understand what the hell we can do about that in the short term. So what we wanted to do with this report is to look ahead at, say, the next 10 to 15 years and reframe the question around how do we reach a long-term outcome where we can have new privacy features that obviously protect users' privacy and provide all the benefits that they normally do, but without having these risks to users in the form of online harms that we're currently experiencing with existing encryption mechanisms. And then we pose this question of what steps can we start taking now then to reach that long-term goal, to push the ball forward, get through this current impasse. And to do that, we engaged with a number of stakeholders within this space. So some law enforcement officials, others child safety organizations like DANS. We also spoke to privacy advocates, as well as those that work in what are known as standards developing organizations or SDOs. They're responsible for maintaining much of the internet's architecture, but also implement a lot of these features to users and devices worldwide. And what was really interesting, what came out from those engagements and around that long-term outcome were these 3 themes, which in my view can really act as sort of guiding principles for those that work in this space to start moving towards progress towards that long-term outcome that I mentioned. So the first is around the problem sets and concerns within this space and approaching this issue. So it was really interesting when we had a number of engagements and roundtables how, depending on who we were engaging with on issues around security and privacy features, they often came of it from a different problem set and a set of priorities. So for instance, when we spoke to industry technicians, people working in SDOs, they often associated security issues with privacy features around cybersecurity. So how do we protect users from potential backdoor vulnerabilities, malicious intrusions into their data that would put their privacy at risk? But in contrast, when we spoke to law enforcement and child safety organizations, they came at this from an issue of safety. So how do we ensure that users aren't at risk of various harms when new privacy features are introduced? And so it's really important to be cognizant of those different risks and concerns, as Florian mentioned, within this space, not just the risks to privacy and cybersecurity, but also to safety, because in doing so, it becomes a lot clearer as to where different communities in the space are coming from around their concerns, but also to start identifying those shared areas of overlap for trying to implement solutions to some of the real-world issues that are materializing on encrypted platforms at the moment. And then secondly, when we engaged with law enforcement in particular, we heard about the challenges that they had, and also this applied to child safety organizations as well, in having any kind of meaningful input over the development of new privacy features. So whether that's at the very early stages with your proof of concepts, early tech industry designs, right the way through over to the standards bodies where those refinements can then take place in public, and then the devices or features are then implemented on a wide scale. And so it's equally thinking about how do we make those process chains more accessible to different stakeholders so that these various concerns and risks around safety and cybersecurity can obviously be fed into those design processes and recognized. And then finally, it's also important to remember that there's no one perfect solution in this space, and actually it's much better to think about it as a compromise, because ultimately you've got things like privacy and security and safety that are all different types of trade-offs. So how can we reach a scenario instead where with any new privacy features, we thoroughly assess the different risks, whether that be around safety, whether that be the implications of someone's privacy, and reduce them to an acceptable level for all stakeholders involved. Now, that's no easy task. I'm not trying to claim that it will be, but in doing so, it provides a more practical orientation to this space. So how can, for instance, we use impact and risk assessments within industry processes when they're designing these features to think about how can we integrate law enforcement voices into this space, for instance, or child safety organizations. So those are the 3 really important themes that came out from those engagements. And I'm just going to finish on a few of the recommendations. There's much more in the actual report, so I recommend checking out the report itself if you're interested in this space. But the two recommendations that I wanted to highlight were firstly one that we made to both industry and law enforcement, and that's around facilitating more secondment schemes and training programs. And really that relates back to my second point on the previous slide around trying to make these processes within the kind of design and R&D phase more accessible. Because if law enforcement can gain an understanding of how and where they can then input any concerns they might have about new privacy features, for instance, if they're fearing that it might have implications for lawful investigations, then obviously that helps to start moving the ball forward with trying to change some of those processes. And the other one that I wanted to pick up on was this one at the bottom for the government, and that's around really that at the moment there's quite a lack of data, particularly up-to-date data, around what the public really wants with new devices in this space. And it's quite easy to assume, for instance, that the public just wants more privacy with any new devices, that they're not willing to compromise on their privacy, even if it means that some of these harms are materializing. But what would be really interesting is to start doing more surveys and focus groups with the public and understand, for instance, would they be willing to compromise on some of their additional layers of anonymity online if it meant that we could help try and improve child safety, for instance. And of course, it might be the case that they don't. But what I think is really important is to try and find that and understand that data, collect that data, and then feed that into industry processes so that hopefully the end product truly reflects what the consumer wants and the user wants. Because ultimately the user is the one that's going to be impacted, whether it be around privacy or safety with these devices. So that's another really important thing to think about. And I'll probably leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam, for that overview. So there's a lot in that report. We won't be able to consider all these topics. If any of you are interested in sort of the wider report, I definitely highly recommend taking a look for yourself. But let's take the remainder of the time that we have to dive deeper into this second principle that you outlined around multi-stakeholder inclusivity. And I'd like to start with a question for you, Dan. So you're active in the space with the Internet Watch Foundation, sort of approaching the topic from a civil society angle. And it'd be great to hear, simply hear your thoughts and more about your experience as a civil society organization in the tech development space. And I know you've also been active in standards development for safety tech, for privacy tech in IETF. So that would be a particular topic. Be interesting to hear more about.
Yeah, very happy to. So the IETF, I hadn't heard of it up until a couple of years ago, and for those of you that aren't aware of it, it's the Internet Engineering Task Force. At the IWF, we really found out about, were made aware of the IETF based on the end results, the protocols that were created by the generally private companies that really decide how the internet works, or primarily the interoperability between systems on the internet. So a really crucial part. And we started seeing the impact of those protocols on our work to technical interventions to detect and prevent access to and distribution of images and videos of children being sexually abused on the internet. And the protocols that are being developed there were being released, and we were seeing them having a negative impact. So I had two really objectives about the IETF, which was firstly to observe, to understand how are these protocols being created, what decisions are being made, and then secondly is there a way of engaging and influencing them? Because they're affecting my work, they're affecting our mission. Perhaps I could go along and explain this to all these engineers, and they'd say, do you know what, we didn't realize that. We'll change the protocols, we'll change how the internet works, and we'll make it safer for children. And I can skip to the end of that story if you want to know how that part went. But the first one was really, really, really fascinating. The second part, less successful as far as the engagement goes. Just to say the value of attending these events is the developments of the things that happen generally in private-owned commercial tech companies, mostly West Coast American companies, you don't see what they do until it's get released. The really great thing about IETF is it is open. Anyone can go if you can afford the plane ticket and the hotel fare, or anyone can sign up to the mailing lists. And for me, I was going into a room full of people, all of the engineers from the biggest tech companies, and it was generally the engineers as opposed to the executives. And I was like being in the cafeteria at Google and hearing these people discussing. So it's a rare opportunity to really see these discussions firsthand. So that, incredibly valuable, really understood a lot about technical protocol development and also the cultural aspects and the ideology and all the sort of stuff, and particularly the American attitude to online privacy and online safety. Engaging and influencing, I would say, would be less successful there. And I'm partially that because I think just the makeup of the amount of people there and the diversity of stakeholders, both geographical stakeholders, gender, ethnicity, and also ideology and point of view. There weren't many people, well, there were a lot of people like me in that they were white, male, middle-aged with a computer science degree from English-speaking companies. Very much one of those, sort of typically one of those group, not a lot from civil society as far as child protection and online safety. So engagement less successful, but as far as a way of helping protocol development and internet development to take more acknowledgement of different groups, I think it is an amazing place and a really rare opportunity where there is that open engagement. I think the IETF as an organization is actually very appreciative and trying to encourage more stakeholders. That's not necessarily true of all the people there, but certainly as a group, I think it's quite open.
So that's a positive note. Thank you for that. One point to potentially come back to later that would be interesting to unpack is that, of course, civil society as a segment itself is quite a diverse segment in the space. If you think about different positions in the privacy security trade-off context, it's anything but a monolithic group. And so, how did that play out in those discussions?
It is actually. One of the really interesting ways that they make decisions at IETF is through what they call rough consensus. And then generally in the room, we all kind of agree and we've addressed the issues. The trouble with consensus is the more diverse you get, the more stakeholders, more geographical locations, different countries, different companies, different civil society groups, academic groups with different points of view, the harder it gets to get that consensus. So it's a kind of a counter in that actually IETF might want more people to go along because I generally believe the more diverse the people in the room, the better the outcomes are. But with consensus, it's harder to get those outcomes. And I think there are some in the rooms that are actually pretty happy with the status quo, and particularly some of the companies there which kind of dominate a lot of those status. But you're right, civil society is not just a checkbox, is I've got someone from civil society. We're not one group any more than governments are the same group or academia is the same group. There are diverse points of view in there. I think you really need to understand and have acknowledgement. And really, if we're talking stakeholder engagement, is one of the stakeholders who are not represented in the design of the internet, from our point of view, is children. They're not. So really, they're children that are relying on others, like IWF and others, to go and represent their point of view and make sure that their voices are heard as well.
That's maybe a good segue for a question for you, Sam, in terms of the engagement and research that you did. Are there any examples of good practice or success stories for, where you've seen, examples of those challenges that Dan just described?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's two examples I want to pick out in particular because they come at it from sort of different perspectives. So one was an initiative set up in the US by the Carnegie Endowment in 2018, and it was known as the Encryption Working Group. And that particular group convened a number of stakeholders, former law enforcement officials, cryptographers, a few people from civil society. And they essentially were tasked with looking at near sort of future trends around encryption technology and developing policy recommendations around what different stakeholders within this community can start thinking about in terms of changing their practices or looking ahead to the horizon about what's possible. And I think that was a really beneficial example of what we're really missing in the UK at the moment is a kind of forum where we can discuss specifically around encryption, the different views and concerns of different communities like Dan's, like privacy advocates, and to start talking out some of these issues and thinking about where those shared areas of concern or touch points are that might then lead progress forward. Because we're seeing lots of similar efforts with AI at the moment, a number of forums, a number of conferences and convening bodies, but we're really lacking that on encryption. And the other example I wanted to mention is coming at it from a more technical perspective, and that's actually a UK example. And so the Safety Check Challenge Fund that was introduced in 2021 was an initiative that encouraged academics and technical researchers to come forward and try and present viable proposals of technical tools that could, say, scan for illegal child sexual abuse material on encrypted platforms without potentially breaking encryption mechanisms. And I think there were about 5 proposals in total that actually won that, and they won some prize money. But what that also showed was those incentives were there to encourage more on the sort of technical side of things, pushing the boundaries about what's possible with the actual technology and trying to identify those technical solutions that can accompany the policy guidance and recommendations that we also need. So it's really about those two separate types of examples, I think, together could offer a lot of benefits in this space in the UK context.
Great, thank you.